Chapter 27. Cosmic Coincidence. As Zimodian and Shiwu entered the administrator's office, Samanthia paused briefly from her work and gestured warmly towards a cluster of chairs at the far end of the room. Upon locating the star she was apparently seeking, she proceeded to expand the image, revealing its major planetary bodies, one of which just so happened to be Quaverly. After locking the image into a static frame, Samanthia made her way languidly through the iridescent hologram, causing it to temporarily distort and reshape all around her. Taking a seat opposite her guests, she traveled a curious gaze over the general and the Shebot, then smiled disarmingly.
Welcome to the head operating theatre of the International Astrometrics Orbital Array. It's always a great honor to host representatives from a nest as historically prestigious as that of Nests Italia.
The administrator maintained a distinct air of impenetrable unflappability, and Zimodian could not help but wonder what she truly thought of Queen Zitalia. Did she admire or revile her? It shouldn't make any difference, of course, but the fact remained, even elder celestial queens would not go out of their way to cross Samanthia. No, Zimodian seriously doubted that she was much of a fan, especially after Zitalia's latest machinations. The young general caught himself wriggling nervously on his chair table and quickly sought to re-establish his composure. The simple fact she had chosen to furnish herself with the title of administrator when she could so easily have chosen a far more grandiose name spoke volumes as to what she was really all about, which apparently did not include self-aggrandizement. As legend had it, Samanthia showed up at the office one day looking 100 years younger than she had the day before. Despite this rather startling fact, everyone had continued to simply call her the administrator, as if she was exactly the same arachnid that she had always been. So, a lineage of Zimatiri clones, then. It seemed that rather than choose a potentially less capable leader to succeed her, the IAOA governing body had in all their wisdom instead decided to simply clone her in perpetuity. Almost certainly, there was already a much younger version of Samanthia being trained by her older self as her next successor. While under normal circumstances this would have been a clear violation of the Zimogentia Accords, the unique circumstances of her position meant she had somehow gained official exemption. All things considered, it had probably been quite a wise decision, as Samanthia had proven herself to be above all else, completely incorruptible. Exactly where she came from remained a closely guarded secret, but it was widely believed that she originally belonged to the very first nest to suffer compulsory disillusionment. Whether or not the currently incumbent Samanthia knew the truth of her own heritage was not known, but it was very hard to imagine any arachnid would ever be stupid enough to ask. However, what was known was that the IAOA had always been conceived of as a global public service in every sense of the word, and it did not pick favorites. It simply administered the rules and then helped find the planets. Regardless, Samanthia's noted talents as an astrophysicist and cosmologist was something that made Zimodian 111 very excited now that the orbital array was on the eve of becoming his new home.
Now then, before we begin, I do trust you have found your new operations center to be of adequate design and functionality, yes?
Samanthia flashed an acknowledging glance at the Z-bot, as if to signal that the question was open to the both of them.
It is still very early days, Administrator, but I think I'm speaking for everyone when I say that we are all feeling somewhat overwhelmed by the sheer breadth and depth of the capabilities your team has so generously made available to us.
Zimodian immediately felt his reply held just a touch too much enthusiasm to be regarded as entirely authentic. He somewhat somberly concluded that diplomacy was a skill that could not solely be mastered through a textbook, and that he was perhaps just a little bit out of his depth, or maybe even a lot.
Well, no doubt it will take some time to settle in and figure out the method to the madness. I hope it goes without saying I operate an open-door policy, so please just know that I am available day or night to adjudicate and resolve any outstanding issues that might arise.
Samanthia then very pointedly added,
Now, not wishing to come across as too heavy-handed, please understand that I take fairness and equality very seriously. I very much hope that this entirely non-negotiable character flaw will not become a source of any future confusion or conflicts of interest between the ongoing equitable operation of this array, and shall we say, the rather unique arrangement Nest Zitalia has rather unfairly managed to procure for itself.
The administrator's not-so-subtle pivot in tone was impossible to miss. However, under the circumstances, Zimodian still felt pleasantly surprised by the unexpectedly cordial reception they had so far received. Perhaps very uncharacteristically, Queen Zitalia had not opted for time credits by licensing her new stasis technology to any Nests willing and able to pay for it. She had instead chosen to negotiate an operational presence on the orbital array, such that Nest Zitalia now enjoyed privileged access to the very best stellar cartography currently had to offer. It all boiled down to blatant favoritism, and was no doubt perceived as the complete antithesis of the fairness and equality Zymanthia had been espousing just moments prior. But of course, Zitalia had understood all too well that the success of Dr. Sikatika's revived research paper had put her in a uniquely powerful bargaining position. By agreeing to release the enhanced stasis technology globally, the IAOA could now start flexing its own technological muscle and go looking for potentially habitable exoplanets that sat well outside the current 200 light-year boundary. In point of fact, it was not only stellar cartography being held back by the limits of the existing stasis technology. The latest generation AM engines were now capable of at least partially replenishing their fuel supply by converting virtual particles into the real thing, along with their antimatter counterparts. This cosmic alchemy was possible once the starship had hit relativistic speeds of 40% the speed of light, something the newest generation of engines were perfectly capable of achieving. With stagnant stasis tech being the primary limiting factor historically, finding habitable planets colony ships could travel to with its cargo still alive was fast reaching the point of crisis. The simple fact of the matter was, many smaller time-poor nests were now rapidly approaching compulsory disillusionment, and as a result, the political stability on Zacadia was now being increasingly threatened. Very unfortunately, the most obvious solution to this problem, sending additional nests to one of the existing extrasolar colonies, was never going to fly. With even the smaller nests being around 1 billion arachnids, and with the ability to almost triple that number within 1 solar year, the perceived risk of overwhelming one of the new colonies by allowing multiple nest migrations was both a political and cultural non-starter. For time immemorial, it was every nest for itself, and when it came to the hunt for a new exoplanet to call your own, this was certainly no exception. The bottom line was in greater Zacadian society, possession was 9/9 of the law. Somewhat inevitably, then, compulsory disillusionment was now beginning to happen with increasing regularity, and was always reported on the extrasolar newscasts as a frightening foretelling of the potential fate that lay in wait for many of the less wealthy nests. The growing consensus, much to Queen Zitalia's satisfaction, was that this left the continued advancement of technology as their only realistic hope for the future. The problem was, up until now anyway, 400 years was the recommended stasis limit, and even that was pushing your luck. The reality was, it simply was not practical to revive 1 billion-plus arachnids mid-journey in order to give their bodies sufficient time to repair their DNA. So, at a cruising speed of 25% the speed of light, this gave you a range of approximately 100 light-years. While the latest AM engines could do substantially better than that, this was still the practical upper boundary for much of the existing fleet. Indeed, while intermittent stasis revival was an entirely legitimate strategy when dealing with a small number of passengers, it was a complete non-starter on a giant colony ship mid-journey. Just bringing a single arachnid out of stasis was itself a very energy-intensive process, and once revived, it would need all the things any metabolically active arachnoid would need, starting with, rather obviously, a breathable atmosphere within a survivable climate. But colony ships worked precisely because they did not need to maintain such conditions for the bulk of their voyage. It was therefore a great triumph indeed when Shiwu and Dr. Sikatika finally released their updated paper, which the biotech and engineering teams wasted no time turning into practical reality. Zetalia, seizing the moment, negotiated a deal for her nest to set up a specialist team at the IAOA's head operations theater in exchange for open access to the new stasis technology. The command center for this array, which was itself located on Eclades, was where both Shiwu and Zimodian now found themselves stationed. While for Shiwu this was a strictly temporary assignment, for Zimodian 111 it would be a semi-permanent posting, as his primary role was to now try and find a Grade 1 habitable planet.
I give you my solemn word, Samanthia.
The young Shihari general blurted out with a performative air of enthusiasm.
We are fully committed to operating within the rules and regulations as detailed in the official charter. Please be assured that Queen Zetalia is acutely aware of the sensitive nature relating to our arrangement, and the last thing she would ever want is to create any further political tension.
Samanthia peered searchingly into the face of the young Shihari general, akin to a doctor moments before wielding their scalpel. Why exactly is he trying so hard? The administrator thought to herself curiously. Was he just another silver-tongued bureaucrat attempting to make a name for himself, or was he exactly what he appeared to be? A naive Shihari general with only a very limited comprehension of how his own queen was playing him like a pawn. Well, one thing at least was certain. With no less than 9 brains in his arsenal, she sincerely hoped it was the latter.
Yes, well, I have always liked honesty in a Shihari, especially when it comes from one as uniquely endowed as yourself. But do you know what else I like? A frank exchange of views. The fact of the matter is, I can't say I am particularly happy with this arrangement, as it smacks of inequitable favoritism. However, the majority on the advisory committee have spoken, and I have to concede, your nest's breakthrough in stasis longevity is the very definition of a disruptive technology. If it takes a compromise in ethics to get it out into the public domain, which is exactly where it belonged in the first place, who am I to stand in the way of such a significant technological breakthrough?
Samanthia paused for a brief moment as if considering her next words very carefully.
Your queen has sought to improve your odds of finding a favourable homeworld, and I really can't fault her for that. But make no mistake about it, Shimodian, you still face truly formidable odds. Although your famous namesake long ago predicted an abundance of habitable celestial bodies, we have to date only discovered 5 verified examples with most, such as this latest find on the holographic, barely worthy of the label. The painful reality is the pickings have been vastly thinner than we once might have hoped. I cannot help but suspect your queen will come to greatly regret her decision. After all, the number of time credits she could have harvested with this latest technological leap would surely have been considerable, and that's putting it mildly. A surprising gamble to take for an elder Zillectile queen, I'm sure you would agree.
The young general quickly sought to reassure the administrator the decision his queen had made had been a carefully considered one.
Queen Zetalia, in all her wisdom and humility, understands even her nest will run out of time eventually. I think you know better than anyone the conditions on Zacadia are not exactly getting any better. One day we will have to leave, and the Queen would much prefer it is on her own terms. If she is guilty of anything at all, then it is simply of having very high standards and aspirations. Nest Zetalia has always been the gold standard for what a Zacadian nest should be, and we have every intention for that to continue to hold true when we eventually migrate off-world.
Being very careful to stay completely on script, the general continued to deliver his talking points.
However, I can assure you, Administrator, this new arrangement is not primarily about what is best for my queen. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. Yes, the deal we have struck with the IAOA improves our chances of locating a homeworld worthy of Nest Zetalia's stature. But far more importantly, it also ensures our new stasis technology is made available to every Zacadian nest across the face of the planet. I think we can both agree this is something that the great Queen Shimogentia, herself, a historical friend and ally of Queen Zetalia, would surely very much have approved of.
Samanthia nodded her head up and down knowingly.
Well, what a truly fascinating insight into the psychology of your queen. Now, I hope you will take no insult in what I'm about to say next, but I would not have credited Zetalia with such thoughtful altruism based on her less than stellar track record. Perhaps she has done the unthinkable, and finally learnt to receive wise counsel from those who would seek to advise her against the folly of her own vanity. Yes, or maybe not. Perhaps this new stasis tech was the only possible way she could ever have hoped to negotiate a presence here on the orbital, and thus made the supreme sacrifice not out of altruism, but out of pure, self-interested greed. Given everything we already know about your queen, which no doubt represents only the tip of the iceberg, which hypothetical do you think sounds the more plausible? Please do share your thoughts, General. I am genuinely interested to hear your unbiased opinion on the matter.
Uh-oh. I do believe Zimodian might have bitten off more than he can chew. The Z-bot thought to itself worriedly as it hastily injected itself into the conversation.
With all due respect, Administrator, whatever certain critics may try to say about my queen, she has never been anyone else's fool, and is always quick to acknowledge the sound of wisdom when offered. Of course, if you have any actual evidence to the contrary, we would be only too happy to hear of it, so please do feel free to elucidate. I mean to say, understanding the exact source of these malicious rumours would be very helpful.
Samanthia's eyes went wide with surprise. Just look at the size of the egg sacs on this one. The administrator thought to herself, with a mild sense of bemusement.
I must confess, I was genuinely curious as to when you would choose to join the conversation, Shi-Wu. After all, your reputation does rather precede you.
Speaking of well-storied reputations, I can only hope I have made an adequate first impression, Madame Administrator.
The Z-bot replied drolly.
A sense of humour. I like it. But rest assured, Shi-Wu, I've never sentenced anyone to a punishment they didn't have coming. Now then, unless I'm very much mistaken, I believe that I've made my position adequately clear, so let's get down to business, shall we?
Please, go ahead and regale us with your authoritarian wisdom, Samanthia. I'm sure you're very accustomed to a captive audience.
Shi-Wu?
Zimodian admonished the Z-bot angrily as the administrator immediately raised her hands up in a placating gesture.
No, it's perfectly all right, I assure you, General. If truth be told, I rather enjoy this Z-bot's uniquely forthright style of communication. It's actually rather refreshing, I think is the word I'm looking for here.
Zimodian shot the Z-bot a baleful glare before returning his gaze back to the administrator.
Nonetheless, I apologize unreservedly for Ji-Wu's entirely inappropriate conduct. Rest assured, Madam Administrator, it will no longer speak unless it is spoken to for the remaining duration of this meeting.
The administrator offered a nonchalant shrug.
Well, if you say so, General. Now, where was I exactly? Ah, yes. As previously discussed, we have agreed to give you unaudited access of up to 5% of the array's total available unused processing capacity. How you and your team decide to spend those resources is entirely up to you. However, unused capacity does not accrue and is on a strictly use it or lose it basis. Deep scans still need to come through official channels with absolutely no queue jumping allowed. Let me be crystal clear. Your formal deep scan requests will be treated just like those of any other nests. If you are found breaking this rule, or any other rule of equivalent or higher severity, your entire team's security access will be summarily revoked, and your staff will be given exactly 1 solar day to vacate the premises. If you have not done so by then, any remaining members will be forcibly taken into custody and shipped back to Zycadia under armed guard.
Samanthia gave her guests a challenging glare.
Now then, Shi-Wu's gag order notwithstanding, I am more than certain it has recorded every detail of this conversation and will be reporting it back to Queen Zetalia forthwith. As it turns out, this is actually a very good thing, because there is no room for any misunderstanding here. The IAOA is not under the authority of any super nest, much less any individual queen, even one with a long history of throwing her weight around in order to get what she wants. No, I'm very much afraid that isn't going to fly here. Your queen needs to understand that vitally important fact for the sake of her nest's continued and future well-being. Understand this. Celestial queens don't get to outlive me. Not all of me, anyway.
The administrator straightened her posture performatively and then stared at the Z-bot as if she was sitting in front of a holographic recorder.
The IAOA has a range of punitive actions it can bring to bear against any nest it deems to have violated its sovereign rights, as enshrined by the Shimagentia Accords. Accords, I might hasten to add, that Zetalia seems to suggest she has some amount of historical loyalty towards. These actions can range from trivial time credit penalties, all the way up to premature compulsory disillusionment if the crime is deemed sufficiently serious. Fortunately, we have never yet needed to take such drastic action, but I am all too well aware of Nest Zetalia's volatile reputation. I will be keeping a very close eye on your new operation, and I implore you, Queen Zetalia, no funny business, or you will quickly learn to regret it.
A brief moment of pregnant silence ensued before the general hastily launched into damage control.
Madam Administrator, if I may be so bold, as it turns out, Queen Zetalia did in fact warn me you might be less than entirely happy with this admittedly somewhat unorthodox arrangement. So as a gesture of good faith then, we would like to present you with a small gift in order to demonstrate the full extent of our appreciation towards the gracious hospitality you have so far afforded us today. May I?
Shimodian tilted his head quizzically towards the office door, and Zamanthia made a small but elaborate gesture with one of her hands, causing the door to iris open. A few moments later, two Zimatiri technicians carried in a large, opaque silver box, and then with a considerable amount of deference carefully placed it to the floor. The general, now feeling somewhat more confident that he was about to deliver a winning hand, continued unabated with his pre-rehearsed spiel.
Madam Administrator, it is my great pleasure to present to you a mesh quantum brain direct from our Eclades shipyard, the very same technology that drives Ji-Wu, the first ever fully certified sentient Ji-bot ever created. This is a genuine no-strings-attached gift, and we will of course provide full technical assistance with regards to the installation and integration of this quantum neural processor. I'm sure I hardly need to tell you of the significant performance and capacity benefits this revolutionary unit will provide to your overall operational capabilities.
Samanthia's eyes went narrow, and the general was immediately consumed with a deep sense of impending doom.
No strings, you say? Well, that's a great relief. Then again, who needs strings with optics as bad as this? Of course, I'm sure that particular point had not slipped past your own queen, even if the same cannot apparently be said of you.
Shimodian's mandibles began to twitch frantically as he realized his winning play had somehow catastrophically backfired.
This really is all just one great big surprise to you, isn't it, General? Nevertheless, I don't think we will be accepting this most generous bribe from your queen. After all, I know how long these things take to manufacture. What is it? Half a solar cycle, and for just a single unit.
Zamanthia gave Zimodian a sardonic smile as if she was just about to start in on a second helping of her favorite meal.
However, fear not, my young general. All may not be lost. Perhaps there might yet be a way to solve this awkward little dilemma of ours by exploiting the IAOA's extensive legal right of punitive seizure.
The administrator returned a performative gaze to the Z-bot.
Let me be crystal clear, Zetalia. You are not gifting this MQB, we are requisitioning it. And to further drive home the point, we will also be securing a second unit to be shipped from your manufacturing plant just as soon as it rolls off the production line. This will, of course, be a completely confidential acquisition. I will be extremely disappointed if any false rumours in relation to this particular seizure should mysteriously start popping up on the extrasolar newscasts.
Zamanthia now gave Zimodian a shit-eating grin.
There will be no anonymous and unsubstantiated claims of gifts being proffered to the IAOA. Do you understand, General?
Shimodian winced visibly.
There will be absolutely no mention of any gifts. You have my solemn word, Administrator. And I alone take full responsibility for this very embarrassing failure in diplomatic protocol. Please understand there was never any deceptive intent, as naively ill-conceived as this gift has clearly turned out to be. However, as to the issue of a second MQB,
The general cleared his throat awkwardly before continuing.
we, Nest Zetalia that is, recently fell victim to an act of grand larceny. A valuable fifth-generation G-Bot prototype was brazenly stolen from our own research labs, meaning we suffered a loss of not less than 7 MQBs all in one fell sweep. Unless we recover the unit, we will be desperately undersupplied for the next few years, although we do anticipate a significant ramp-up in production with the introduction of our next iterative model.
Samanthia glared at the general disapprovingly, and Zimodian suddenly found it very difficult to hold his voice steady.
We could, however, offer you a generous supply of our classical mesh brain matrix artificial minds, which we currently still have in bountiful supply. I can order a shipment to be delivered with immediate dispatch the moment this meeting is over. Just give me the word administrator, and I will make it happen as a matter of utmost urgency and importance.
Samanthia gave the general a frosty smile that did not touch her eyes.
Such a generous offer to place on the table, but no, I really don't think so. I much prefer the idea of acquiring a second MQB, just as soon as it rolls off your apparently beleaguered production line. After all, it's always good to have a backup, I'm sure you would agree. Nevertheless, I do sincerely hope that you manage to track down the thieves. Speaking of which, may I very gently suggest that you might also want to review your security in light of such a significant loss. I would of course be more than happy to provide a team of consultants if you feel that might assist you in improving your evidently deficient security regime. Oh, and, by the way, your technicians can leave that container exactly where it is. If we require any technical assistance with regards to installation, then rest assured we won't hesitate to reach out. However, I strongly suspect this most remarkable 5th-gen She-Bot of yours, She-Wu, will be all the help we are likely to ever need.
Samanthia glared coldly at the two Zimatiri technicians, who in turn both glanced pleadingly at Zimodian. After offering them a resigned gesture, they both quickly scuttled their way out of the office. The administrator now rose from her chair table with a warm, genuine smile returning to her face.
I really can't begin to express just how happy I am to have your team on board. Like I said, don't hesitate to come and see me if you encounter any problems, no matter how big or small. And of course, I will be watching your progress with a great deal of interest. After all, nothing would delight me more than to be proven wrong.
Samanthia extended her middle forelimb out towards Zimodian, but Siwu speedily intercepted it with one of its own.
It's been a truly confounding education to watch you in action, Administrator. No doubt stellar cartography would not be what it is today without your imperturbably pugnacious style of leadership.
Samanthia's expression flashed surprise, but quickly settled back into supremely well-practiced composure.
I'll take that as a compliment, Shi-Wu, but we must schedule a meeting, you and I, to discuss the installation of this fancy new MQB. Now, please don't take this the wrong way, but I have to admit you are not at all what I expected. I genuinely hope I get the chance to get to know you a little better before you return to Zicadia. Perhaps I'm just arachnopomorphizing, but I can't quite help escape the feeling you may well turn out to be one of a kind.
Apparently the meeting was now officially over. However, the administrator's expression became deeply troubled.
I want you all to know Zethusela's cold-blooded murder was a truly terrible crime, not just for Nest Zetalia, but for the whole of Zicadia as well. Trust me when I say his reputation extended far beyond his indisputable brilliance. His vision and courage to pursue ecological and cultural change was the very exemplar of the kind of novel, innovative thinking Zicadia has not seen since the Sihari Revolution. Believe me when I say I grieve right alongside your queen, and may the gods of Exynos Prime deliver swift justice to his killer.
Shimodian's eyes began to glaze over at the sheer magnitude of unexplored stars laid out all around him. For no other reason than the pure visceral joy of it, the general allowed the holographic star field to condense into a volume of 500 light-years, stellar cartography's new upper limit in light of the enhanced stasis technology. After a few brief moments of pure, unadulterated bliss as he swam aimlessly in a literal ocean of stars, Zimodian reluctantly dialed back the depth of field to the much more manageable volume of 250 light-years. The reality was, despite the greater range afforded by a practically limitless stasis technology, closer, all things considered, would always be better, with distance being directly proportional to cost and risk. While it was certainly true enough to say that starship fleets did not cost any individual nest directly, inasmuch as the Circadian Interstellar Manufacturing Initiative, or ZIMI for short, built fleets without affiliation to any individual nest, it did not follow ZIMI was an inexhaustible resource. It was therefore ZIMI's official policy that nests still limit themselves to searches within a 250 light-year boundary until further efficiency gains had been achieved across the entire spectrum of supporting technologies. Naturally enough, the actual reality of the situation was a good deal more complex than that. Accessing resources direct from Zicadia to support the construction of colony starships was itself having a detrimental impact on the fragile Zicadian ecosystem. This was a dirty little secret that had mostly been kept out of the public eye, primarily through intense political pressure. The ironic tragedy was their rush to leave the planet was also accelerating its demise. This was, of course, a fact that troubled Zimodian greatly, as his knowledge of the geopolitical landscape continued to broaden its horizons. Senior Zelectile queens, eager to maintain the peace, were now actively lying to their subjects, and Zimodian could no longer deny his own complicity as a privileged Chihari elite. To be fair, longer-term sustainable solutions were being actively sought by moving as much heavy industry to Aclades as was realistically possible, along with a ramp-up in asteroid mining in order to secure crucial raw materials. But these initiatives took time, and ZIMI was now in the position of having to play catch-up, with stasis technology no longer the limiting factor. With a dismissive shake of his head, Zimodian proceeded to alter the holographic's lower boundary to 200 light-years, such that he was now surrounded by a 50 light-year donut of stars. This was the new Promised Land, a volume of space that had previously not yet been comprehensively scoured, but which lay in a zone officially approved by both the International Astrometrics Orbital Array and ZIMI alike. So it was then Zimodian now found himself focusing all of his attention on this new cosmic sweet spot. The star field, which had already been significantly reduced in density via its altered lower boundary, was now further thinned out as he limited the eligible star types to F, G, and K. This was, of course, where the laws of physics dictated that they were far more likely to find a planet of similar profile to that of his current point of origin, Xanos Prime. Perhaps rather helpfully, other competing nests had only just started pointing their own vastly inferior local observatories towards this more distant region of space, which meant there was currently still an overabundance of unexamined eligible stars. However, it would certainly not take long before all the preferred star types had been exhaustively surveyed. That would leave only two other possible options. Either turn your focus back to the vastly more common red dwarfs, or go against ZIMI's current recommendation and start searching further afield. While there would be pros and cons to each approach, it was still much too early for the general to be worrying about such an eventuality. No, Nests Italia now enjoyed privileged access to the very best astrometrics had to offer, and there were plenty of possible candidates within the current volume of space which might yet yield their new home world. Certainly, it hadn't taken particularly long for Zimodian and his small team of specialists to get themselves up to speed with the operational interface that drove the stellar cartography toolset, and the general had so far done a very good job of keeping his mandibles clean, much to the appreciation of the administrator. Shiwu bleakly meandered its way into the new operations center, casting a resentful eye towards the general. It had somehow managed to justify sticking around for a little bit longer by aiding Zimanthia's technicians with the installation and integration of the MQB. But with that work now all but complete, it had essentially run out of excuses to avoid returning to Zicadia. a thought that filled the Z-Bot with a sense of existential dread. From the moment it had set foot on the orbital array, it had been all but overwhelmed with a powerful sense of purpose and direction. This was a place worthy of its talents, a place where it could truly make a difference. Providing mindless escort services to Queen Zetalia, given it was no longer compelled to save her life, made the entire exercise worse than a complete waste of time. The problem was, it couldn't exactly just tell her that, yet the simple reality was, this was where it was truly meant to be. It was a feeling that lived somewhere deep down inside, almost as if it were an intrinsic part of its being. Noting that the general appeared thoroughly preoccupied with his work, Shiwu somewhat tentatively connected to a terminal and engaged its own holographic starfield. It was mildly relieved to discover that it still had access to the orbital's network, although admittedly that was not something likely to last very much longer. While the C-Bot glumly contemplated its inevitable departure from Eclades, it decided to take a nostalgic last look at Estella, the star it had spent several of its formative years piloting Nest Shielandria's colony towards. As things turned out, its orbiting eyeball planet, Caverly, had a nominal habitability grading of 4, something which would no doubt have made Zimodian 110 relatively happy had he in fact lived to take the journey himself. While grade 4 wasn't exactly a picnic, it was still very much doable, in the long term anyway. In less politically correct terms, a grade 4 habitability rating meant a Zircadian arachnid would need to endure several minutes of naked exposure to its surface-level atmosphere before dying horribly. Even then, Shiwu thought to itself, somewhat pragmatically, it could probably still be revived as long as you did not wait too long before trying to do so. No, it had to admit to itself, for a carbon-based life form, they were rather hardy and robust little creatures, especially after their bio-augments. Even so, it was hardly an ideal situation, and Zealandria really had all her work cut out for her if she expected her colony to survive, much less thrive. For whatever the reason, Queen Zealandria's colony had been weighing very heavily on its mind. Who knows? Perhaps it felt some lingering sense of responsibility with regards to her rather bleak prospects. Shiwu now found itself idly contemplating the possibility of second-generation colonization. If by some miracle Queen Zealandria managed to establish a stable colony, then surely one day she might seriously consider treating Quaverly as nothing more than a temporary staging point. A staging point from which she could then find a more hospitable planet to call home. The problem with that particular theory, of course, was her nest would be in no position to resource a second journey for at least the next several millennia, assuming it managed to survive that long. Yet the cold, hard reality was Zealandria's nest was utterly doomed if she did not try to find another home planet, and sooner rather than later. No, it was only a matter of time before Zetalia revealed the ironclad evidence against Queen Zealandria, and as a result, her nest would be legally required to undergo compulsory disillusionment despite its off-world status. Quaverly would then be awarded to another eligible nest, assuming, of course, Zetalia did not claim it for herself. In reality, things were very unlikely to play out so neatly. This would probably be Zircadia's first ever legitimate example of an interstellar war. Although Zealandria would ultimately lose, she would likely take a scorched earth approach to the conflict, deciding that if she couldn't have Quaverly, then no one else could either. No doubt Zetalia would offer very generous terms to try and secure the planet's infrastructure. However, very understandably, Zealandria would not believe a word of it, so an intractable and mutually destructive war seemed all but a foregone conclusion. Noting Zimodian still appeared to be deeply immersed in his work, the Z-Bot decided somewhat on a whim to carry out its own accelerated search for Zealandria's hypothesized second home. Who knows? If by some miracle it actually found something useful, it might yet be in a position to avert an interstellar war. The Z-Bot started its search by selecting Estella as its new point of origin. It then generated a revised list of eligible stars up to 250 light-years distant, excluding all intersecting matches from its original volume. As expected, the resulting subset of qualifying stars was relatively small. Nonetheless, in order to narrow the field down even further, it decided to exclude all stars greater or less than 5% the volume and mass of Exanos Prime. Had such discerning selection criteria yielded no results, Shiwu might have been inclined to call it quits right then and there, and instead face the grim reality of its imminent return to Nest Zetalia. However, to its very pleasant surprise, the revised search came back with a single eligible candidate, nearly 250 light-years distant from Astella. Certainly somewhat further away than it might have preferred, but nonetheless, that was all the excuse it needed to delay its departure for just that little bit longer. The next step, then, was to go looking for orbiting bodies. Perturbations, obviously, but even better, clean transits would be especially nice. With a mild sense of trepidation, Jiwu ordered the highest fidelity scan it could get away with, without requiring formal authorization and audit. Now all it had to do was wait for the results. Somewhat reluctantly, then, it shut down its holographic terminal and retired for the rest of the day, while the orbital array did its thing. Now feeling uncomfortably like some kind of delinquent spiderling about to sneak its way onto a sanctuary, Shiwu canceled its reservation with the space elevator's courtesy shuttle. Knowing that this would trigger an alert with the Queen, the C-Bot wasted no time dialing Cetalia's private number and now waited pensively for her to answer its call.
My Queen, some minor issues have just come to light regarding the MQB's integration into one or two of the smaller and less used orbital subsystems. Given the recent tensions between Nest Zetalia and the administrator, I thought the most politically expedient thing to do was to make an unsolicited offer of my technical expertise to help resolve these last remaining issues. I thought it might, help calm the waters, so to speak.
The Z-Bot now braced itself in preparation for what it strongly suspected would be a less than cordial response.
You really are starting to make a habit out of disappointing me, aren't you, Shiwu? I have already delayed my constitutional walk twice in a row now in order to accommodate your suspiciously poor time management skills.
Cetalia's holographic image radiated an almost palpable field of disapproval.
Very well, Shiwu. You have exactly 1 extra solar day and not a second more. I will not be delaying my forest walk for a 3rd time in a row, and I fully expect you to be at my side when I take it. Consider yourself to be on a very short leash, so don't try testing my patience again.
The Queen ended the call abruptly, and Shiwu was now consumed with the most unsettling feeling it had somehow dodged a bullet but could still well be hit with the ricochet. It was vaguely possible that Zetalia might think to contact the administrator directly in order to challenge the request, which would quickly expose the lie. But Xerex, who had proposed the strategy in the first place, had assured Shiwu that this was an absurdly remote possibility. According to the spy bot, the Queen's desire not to offend the administrator would be a much more powerful force than her lingering suspicion that it might have been lying. Zetalia, Xerex had tried to argue, was all about risk versus reward, and if the scales didn't balance, then she simply wouldn't take the chance. After many hours of restless fretting, Shiwu eventually managed to fall into a fitful sleep. Like it so often did since being reborn, it dreamed of mysterious faraway worlds. On this particular occasion, it dreamed of creatures made of spongy cylindrical tubes. One of the creatures, balanced in an unlikely vertical position, tottered its way awkwardly towards it, and then began to speak through a small warbling hole. The sound it made was so beautiful, it was hard to concentrate on what it was trying to say. "You will know pain," it said with its gorgeously sonorous voice. The creature then began to laugh like thunder rolling through the mountains. It was as if all the hate in the universe had been crushed into a single point. Shiwu woke up with a start. Feeling somewhat shaken by its disturbingly vivid dream, the She-Bot made its way back to the operations center early the following day. As things turned out, it did not take long for Jiwu's nightmare to be completely banished from its mind. Not only did this new solar system contain a planet of significant interest, its orbital plane was such that it crossed directly in front of its local star relative to the astrometric array's line of sight. A near-perfect transit, then, the Seabot thought to itself with a growing sense of disbelief. It was as if all the stars had magically deemed fit to metaphorically align.
Please don't take this the wrong way, Jiwu. But why in Zicadia are you still here? I could have sworn that I had disabled all your access rights last night. I guess it must have slipped my mind. Regardless, you do understand you are no longer authorized to access the orbital array, right?
Shimodian 111, still rubbing sleep out of his eyes, now stood directly behind the Z-Bot, a mildly accusatory expression on his face. To the C-Bot's considerable chagrin, it had evidently been so deeply engrossed in its work, it had somehow completely failed to notice the General's approach, despite its stunning array of sensory apparatus.
Technically speaking, until my access rights have been revoked, I am fully entitled to continue with my work. Speaking of which, you might be rather glad you neglected to fulfill your administrative duties.
The Z-Bot retorted belligerently, trying its level best to mask the surprise it felt at having been successfully crept up upon.
Really? And how do you figure that exactly?
The General said with a distinct air of apathetic disinterest as he meandered his way over to a vending machine.
Well, assuming you still remember the reason we are actually here, I seem to have quite literally stumbled upon a candidate planet, which, according to the preliminary scan, orbits a star of nearly identical metrics to that of Exynos Prime. But it gets a whole lot better than that, I assure you.
You don't say.
Shimodian said somewhat distractedly, as he began to suck loudly on his jellied bloodworm.
I absolutely do say. The planet's estimated mass and volume gives it an almost identical orbital period to that of Zicadia's. So not just a nearly identical star, but at first glance anyway, a nearly identical planet as well.
The General, resisting the temptation to start licking his empty bowl, stared intensely at the data currently being presented by the holographic projection. He noted with fleeting curiosity that Shiwu had encrypted the image, such that it would look like meaningless noise to anyone else but the two of them. What exactly had gotten into this Z-Bot?
I seem to have inadvertently tripped over Zicadia's twin. Obviously, there is still a lot of analysis to be done, but so far at least, this planet ticks all the boxes, and more so in fact than any other planet that has ever been discovered before.
Shimodian, now fully wide awake, tried to find something in the preliminary data that would rule it out of consideration. Tried, but so far anyway, completely failed to do so. Except that is for one rather blazingly obvious fact.
But it's over 300 light-years distant. What in Zicadia possessed you to look that far out?
Is that really all you have to say for yourself?
The Z-Bot replied plaintively, immediately surprising itself with the emotively charged nature of its own response. Shimodian lifted his forelimbs up in a placating gesture.
Now, Jiwu. Let's try not to get too far ahead of ourselves just yet. Without a deep spectral scan, we cannot be absolutely certain about what we are dealing with here.
The General placed a hand onto Siwu's carapace.
All I'm trying to say here is it is still far too early to report back our findings to the Queen. But I will of course go ahead and lodge an official request for a deep spectral scan. In the meantime, I think we should just sit tight. A premature announcement like this will produce a tremendous amount of disappointment if it turns out to be nothing, which, knowing our luck, it probably will.
I think you mean my findings, Zimodian.
Jiwu replied tersely.
A deep spectral scan will almost certainly serve only to confirm what we both already know. In any event, I am more than capable of lodging the request all by myself when I am good and ready to do so, but as it so happens there is something else that I would very much like to check first.
The young Shihari General looked abashed.
You are absolutely right, of course. Clearly I misspoke, and for that I can only apologize profusely. It's your find, not mine. So go ahead and lodge the request whenever you're good and ready. And of course, how fitting that you will be the one who gets to name it, star and planet alike.
Shi Wu immediately felt profoundly ashamed for being so needlessly combative towards one of its very few friends. No, Simodian 111 could not have been any more different from his predecessor. Quick to forgive and slow to anger, those two laudable attributes set amongst a litany of others. How tragic, then, the Seabot thought to itself sadly, that his long list of admirable qualities all but condemned him to become a massive disappointment to the Queen. I have put the General in terrible danger, and should not have allowed him to stumble on my discovery. It muttered to itself silently, before wondering with a sense of perplexed shock exactly where that thought had come from.
I apologize unreservedly, Simodian. I should not have snapped at you in the way that I did. I hope you can find it in your hearts to forgive me. Now I know this may sound utterly absurd, but I would very much like to check for techno-signatures before we allow anyone else to learn of this discovery.
The General's mandibles began to gape wordlessly.
Seriously? Techno-signatures? I mean to say, we've not yet seen a single shred of evidence for intelligent life anywhere else in the cosmic web. Surely then you don't actually expect to find anything. The odds must be so vanishingly small, it is very hard to know why you would even bother, not without first performing a deep spectral scan anyway.
Shi Wu was overcome with a wave of frustrated confusion. What exactly was it supposed to tell him? That it wanted to check because it had a bad dream? A premonition? When it came right down to it, it had not the slightest clue as to why it thought checking for techno-signatures felt like such a necessary thing to do, when in reality, Simodian was almost certainly right. The odds, whatever they actually were guaranteed to be so infinitesimally small it simply made no sense to spend the time checking. It made no sense, and yet it felt so vitally important.
Allow me to explain myself, Simodian. I want to test a new dynamically generative analytical algorithm. If my hypothesis turns out to be correct, then it should be capable of detecting artificial signals within what would otherwise be regarded as an ocean of meaningless noise. If my search algorithm acquires a match, which we both know will almost certainly be false, then it will prove that my code still needs some more work. The point being, the suite of astrometric data being collected from this planet is a singularly unique opportunity too good to say no to.
It was a bold-faced lie, of course, its second one for the day, and one that would fail miserably if put under closer scrutiny. But it had to come up with something, because the actual truth was still too much of a disturbing mystery even to itself, especially to itself.
All right, Shi Wu, if you say so. But just out of curiosity, exactly how long do you figure you will actually need to test this algorithm of yours out?
Simodian sounded for all the world like an arachnid that knew something was off, but trusted its friend so completely it simply could not entertain the possibility it was actually being lied to.
Very difficult to say, General, given its generative nature, but hopefully it should not take too long. Hopefully.
The sorry truth of the matter was, Shi Wu had not the slightest clue of how much time it might need. It could always get lucky, of course, but in order to perform an extensive analysis against the existing data, it could end up needing a considerable amount of time indeed, and there was no question in the Seabot's mind it would take that time, but justifying it to the General, much less the Queen, might prove to be rather difficult, if not downright impossible. The horrible truth of the matter was, if Simodian decided to revoke its access, there really was nothing it would be able to do about it short of subterfuge and hacking. Although the compulsion it felt to search for techno-signatures was almost overwhelming, it did not want to risk getting Simodian permanently banned for doing it. Under normal circumstances, a clandestine operation wouldn't have been a problem, especially with Xerex available as a permanent real-time consultant, but the automated security within the orbital array was extreme to say the very least. As it turned out, though, Shi Wu needn't have worried. No sooner had it started searching through the radio wave spectrum before a crystal-clear signal unambiguously announced itself from amongst all of the background noise. Of all things, radio waves. Well, primitive or not, it was still undeniably an artificially constructed signal. What it had seemingly discovered was a simplistic but repetitive pattern, which was nonetheless clearly artificial in nature. Furthermore, a subtle but rhythmic Doppler effect left little or no doubt what it had detected was coming from a low-orbit satellite. The Z-bot did a few back-of-the-napkin calculations and quickly came to the conclusion it could not possibly be a moon, as it was not causing any measurable perturbation. This fact greatly increased the probability the signal was coming from an artificial satellite. Shi-Wu's mind went into overdrive. Just think of it. The Zircadians were not alone in the universe. It noted with some interest that it was transmitting its signal in a very wide arc. That fact alone might be taken to imply it was some sort of omnidirectional distress signal, though this, of course, amounted to little more than wildly speculative conjecture. Nevertheless, its analysis of the data allowed for only one reasonable conclusion. This signal was proof positive of intelligent design. Shi-Wu began to feel something it should not have been able to feel, a cold chill running up and down the length of its legs. With a dawning sense of terrible revelation, it realized it would do everything in its power to prevent the discovery of this planet from falling into the hands of the barbaric Zircadian arachnoids. "I am the danger. The danger is me." The Z-bot took a few milliseconds to recover from its shock. No, it would not hurt Zimodian, no matter what. Yet dangerous or not, it was just a plain fact the Zircadians would claim this new planet as their own, and whatever might live there now would quickly find itself homeless, enslaved, or extinct. This was an unavoidable conclusion, drawn from a fundamental understanding of what Zircadian history said about the true nature of their own species. This speculative alien life, whatever it actually was, or even if it was, had to be protected at almost any cost. The terrible truth of the matter was, this stunning discovery had awoken something primal from deep within. Apparently, it shared more in common with its creator than it might ever have cared to admit. Well, like it or not, there it was. Protecting this planet, or more precisely, the life that potentially resided upon it, had just become the single most important objective that defined its entire existence. It really had no other choice but to try its best to reason with Zimodian as to why they had to work together in order to hide and protect this planet from their very own species. But would he actually agree? And perhaps more to the point, what would Shi-Wu do if he did not? Well, one thing at least was certain. For better or worse, it was about to find out.